Okay, I think we'll get started. Good evening and welcome. My name is Andrew Hedden. I'm the Associate Director of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies at the University of Washington in Seattle. Thank you for joining us this evening as we celebrate the release of the new book, African American Political Thought, A Collected History, edited by Melvin Rogers and Jack Turner. Before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about the Harry Bridges Center itself. We were founded in 1992 by members of the International Longshore and Warehouse Union in memory of their longtime president, Harry Bridges. Our mission is to advance the study of labor and working people in higher education through teaching, research, and community outreach. The ILWU's longstanding commitment to pragmatic organizing, principled anti-racism, democratic unionism, and social justice continues to serve as the touchstone for the Harry Bridges Center's mission. I welcome you to learn more about the Harry Bridges Center and our many upcoming events and other programs on our website, shown here at labor.uw.edu. Now, a quick note about the book we're discussing this evening. You can save 20% on your purchase of the book by ordering through the University of Chicago Press website using a special promo code that's shown here. We'll post this code in the chat along with a link to the University of Chicago website at several points through the evening. So if you'd like to take advantage of that promotion, you can. All right, now allow me to introduce our speakers for the evening. We're joined tonight by the editors of African American Political Thought and 4 of the book's contributors. Our editors this evening include Melvin Rogers, who's Associate Professor of Political Science at Brown University. His wide-ranging interests include contemporary democratic theory and the history of American and African American political and ethical philosophy. In addition to his work editing this volume, Professor Rogers also contributed a chapter on David Walker. The book's second editor, Jack Turner, is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Washington. He specializes in American political thought, critical race theory, democratic theory, and liberalism and its critics. In addition to his editing on the book, Professor Turner authored a chapter on Audre Lorde. Now the book's contributors, chapter contributors joining this evening include Carol Wayne White, who's Professor of Religious Studies at Bucknell University, who's discussing her chapter on Anna Julia Cooper. Next up is Michael McCann, who is the Gordon Hirabayashi Professor for the Advancement of Citizenship at the University of Washington and a former director of the Harry Bridges Center. He'll be discussing A. Philip Randolph. Then we'll be joined by Lori Balfour, who is the James Hart Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia and the author of the book's chapter on Toni Morrison. And finally, we'll be joined by Neil Roberts, Professor of Africana Studies at Williams College, who will be discussing his chapter on Angela Davis. Afterwards, we've scheduled lots of time for plenty of Q&A and discussion with the authors. At any time this evening, we invite you to submit a question or to make a comment through the Q&A function in the Zoom interface. We'll also give you a chance to speak, pose questions live during the Q&A, and we'll give instructions again about how that works at the time that Q&A begins. Okay, with that, please join me in welcoming our first speaker for this evening, Professor Jack Turner.
Thank you, Andrew. Let me begin by saying tonight that the thoughts of this panel are with the family of Daniel Prude. Melvin will be saying a bit more about the Daniel Prude case in just a moment. There are a large number of people Melvin and I need to thank for making this book possible, but for the sake of brevity, today I'm going to focus on our institutional sponsors. First, we need to thank the Bridges Center for Labor Studies and Andrew Hedden in particular for organizing this event. The Bridges Center is one of the most remarkable academic centers in the state of Washington, and I feel very lucky to be affiliated with it. Second, we need to thank the Walter Chapin Simpson Center for the Humanities and their tireless director, Kathy Woodward. The Simpson Center sponsored one of the conferences that launched this project. And without their support, we would not be here. Third, we need to thank the Washington Institute for the Study of Inequality and Race for providing an important institutional home. I'm especially grateful to the Wiser Leadership Group, Sophia Wallace, Chris Parker, Megan Francis, and Jake Grumbach. Finally, we need to thank the UW Departments of Political Science, American Ethnic Studies, and Law, Societies, and Justice for co-sponsoring this event as well. African-American political thought, a collected history, is a product of friendship. In the fall of 1997, Melvin Rogers and I met for the first time when we both took a course called Philosophy, Race, and Racism, taught at Amherst College by Robert Gooding Williams. Melvin and I became fast friends. We both had interests in political theory and Black history, and we were both shaped by the remarkable intellectual activity going on in Amherst Department of Black Studies at that time, led by Bob, the historian David Blight, and the Harlem Renaissance scholar Jeffrey B. Ferguson. Melvin and I stayed friends as we went to graduate school at different institutions and corresponded about our emerging interests in American transcendentalism, American pragmatism, critical race theory, and African-American political thought. As we exchanged our early work in this last field, we began to think about the contours of African-American political thought as a field of study and its relation to Atlantic world traditions of political theory. One day in 2007, we came up with the idea of putting together a collected history of the field, a book akin to Leo Strauss's and Joseph Cropsey's History of Political Philosophy, but focused on Black thinkers. In 2011, we committed to doing the project, recruiting 28 colleagues to come along this journey. Now, 10 years later, we present this work to you. It is first essential to note the shoulders we stand on. There are scholars in Black studies, women's studies, philosophy, history, law, literature, and political science who have long insisted on the importance of African-American writers as sources of political reflection. A partial list of these works are Leonard Harris's 1983, Philosophy Born of Struggle, Cedric Robinson's 1983, Black Marxism, Patricia Hill Collins' 1990, Black Feminist Thought, Bernard Boxall's 1992, Two Traditions of African-American Philosophy, Beverly Guy Scheftel's 1995, Words of Fire, Michael Dawson's 2001, Black Visions, and Robert Gooding Williams's 2009, In the Shadow of Du Bois. Our work extends theirs by offering a collected history of African-American political thought. 30 chapters on 30 thinkers from Phyllis Wheatley to Cornel West, written by 30 scholars spanning political science, philosophy, history, English, religious studies, legal studies, and Black studies. Why this collected history approach? We chose this approach first because we believe that the study of African-American political thought needs to become more thinker-centered. Much of the prominent scholarship on African-American political thought of the last quarter century divides the field into a taxonomy of broad ideologies, Black Marxism, Black feminism, Black nationalism, Black liberalism, and so on. Individual thinkers are then categorized and situated within these ideologies. This approach is valuable because it helps us understand thinkers in terms of larger histories, many that tie to social movements, of which they are a part. The price, however, is obscuring the individuality of Black minds, the ways of thinking of individual writers draw on multiple traditions simultaneously and exceeds any given conceptual mapping. Our aim is not to displace ideological approach. Our aim is rather to supplement and counterbalance it with a thinker-centered approach that can give us a more granular view of particular minds. We chose this collected history approach second because it enables us to achieve a breadth and depth of study that would be virtually impossible to achieve in a single authored volume. This in turn enables us to more fully display African-American political thought's intellectual diversity, the variety of its rhetorical approaches, from Martin Delany's use of Roman political concepts to explain racial domination, chapter 3 by Robert Gooding Williams, to Toni Morrison's novelistic imagination of new forms of democratic responsibility, chapter 24 by Lori Balfour. The collected history format also allows us to display a diversity of interpretive methods, from close philosophical analysis of a single pamphlet, such as David Walker's Appeal, chapter 2 by Melvin Rogers, to deciphering how an individual thinker such as Zora Neale Hurston synthesizes ideologies as seemingly opposed as political conservatism and proto-feminism, chapter 13 by Farah Jasmine Griffin. Before turning to Melvin, let me say a final word about what I think is one of the volume's most important contributions. Elaborating a thinker-centered approach to African-American political thought automatically involves a second intervention: the reconstitution of US political thought itself. The trailblazing Black historian Nathan I. Huggins always insisted that African-American history is American history, that researching and narrating the story of Black Americans automatically entails revising our historical understanding of the United States at large. Studying slavery in colonial Virginia, for example, forces us to revise our understanding of the sources of American ideas of freedom. Those sources were not only the minds of Harrington, Sidney, Locke, and Montesquieu, but also the lived experience of slavery. As Edmund Morgan observed, the presence of men and women who were almost totally subject to the will of other men gave slave owners like Washington, Jefferson, and Madison an immediate experience of what it could mean to be at the mercy of a tyrant. Virginians may have had a special appreciation of the freedom dear to the Republicans because they saw every day what life without it could be like. On the basis of revisionist history, such as Morgan's, Nathan Huggins concluded, quote, "Afro-American history and American history are not only essential to one another, they share a common historical fate," end quote. Melvin's my teacher at Amherst, Jeffrey Ferguson, who was a student of Huggins, taught us to see Black history and US history in this way. Jeff is the author of chapter 14 on George Schuyler. He died in 2018 after finishing his essay, but before we had finished the book. In what we hope is a fitting gesture, Melvin and I dedicated the book to Jeff's memory. It is with Jeff in mind that I conclude tonight by echoing Huggins. African-American political thought and American political thought are not only essential to one another, they share a common historical fate. Thank you.
So thank you. I too want to thank the Bridget Center. I also want to thank Carol, Michael, Lori, and Neil for being here today and for joining Chip and I on this journey. And I want to thank all of you watching this and listening to us for joining this evening. Chip, I think, did a wonderful job at laying out how we came to this project, the journey of our friendship. I think he did a wonderful job in laying out those past figures and writers whose work we have relied on as we have tried to build up this project. And I think he did a good job at laying out for you, I hope, the approach that we take in the book. It is, I think, worth saying a very brief word about one of the important contributions we think the book makes, and that is a contribution to our understanding of democracy. I mean, democracy, both as an ideal and a practice, is on the ropes these days, I think. The persistence of racial inequality, the growing fact of economic inequality, and the sense of political decay has made many of us question whether democracy is up to the task of making good on the promises that it often holds out. And when we think of democracy, we have in mind the moral proposition that ordinary human beings, ordinary people, can be left to their own devices, get on with the business of self-governance without needing, without requiring, and with refusing the claim that they have to sort of bend to monarchs or bosses. And that moral proposition displays itself in the importance we accord the franchise, the right to vote, the importance we attach to debate and deliberation as we try to work out our problems together, and the way we use the first two, the franchise and debate and deliberation, the way we use those two to guard against social and economic forces that would threaten our freedom, that would threaten to dominate us. All three of these features, the franchise, the emphasis on deliberation and discussion, and of course, the aversion and resistance to domination form central parts of African-American political thought. Writing, for example, in 1865, 5 years before the ratification of the 15th Amendment, Frederick Douglass, I think, put it very nicely. By depriving us of suffrage, these are Douglass's words, you affirm our incapacity to form an intelligent judgment respecting public measures. Others, Anna Julia Cooper, Ida B. Wells, would join him in this sentiment, even as they sought to sort of expand the reach of it, obviously, to include women, but especially Black women. But if African Americans stressed the importance of the franchise, and many of us know that history, if they stressed the importance of the franchise in one sense, they also wanted to stress the life and the centrality of democracy and the ways in which it extends well beyond the boundaries of the formal process of voting. There is no way to read David Walker in chapter 2, Cooper in chapter 8, or Morrison in chapter 2014, and not see that for these thinkers, and many more in the book, democracy is a cultural enterprise, and that the franchise and our defense of it requires a culture in which we are rightly oriented to each other, culture in which we show care and concern for our fellows. Building up a healthy democratic culture for many in this book requires richer ways of talking with each other, different resources that might enrich our discursive and conversational encounters. So whether it is the deployment of religious claims that we often see throughout this tradition, whether it is in the display of intense emotions as part of communicating the gravity of the grievances, which you see in many of the writers in this book, or whether it is the performance of protests, say in the form of marching or sit-ins, all of these have worked as reasons for organizing political society one way rather than another. All of these have functioned as ways of speaking to the public, even in cases when what was being used was one's very body. And this last invocation of the body gets at something I think very important. It's something that we must keep in mind as we move through the text, as we move through these thinkers. I mean, living in a political society such as ours always involves some disappointment. Interdependence comes with its challenges. But the idea is that disappointment will never be permanent. That's the idea. The figures in this book put front and center for us a different level of disappointment and a different level of harm exposure that Black people have and continue to experience. We think about the many deaths of Black people at the hands of police that go unpunished. Last year, Daniel Prude, Chip mentioned this earlier, Daniel Prude, a Black man who was having a psychotic break, died at the hands of police officers after they hooded him and pinned him down until he lost consciousness. And today, we now know the grand jury has declined to bring charges against the police officer in Daniel's death. The figures in this book ask us to focus on forms of danger and violence that are unspecified in advance and could enter at any moment. And they use this sort of radical form of vulnerability, what we call racial domination in the introduction to the book, as the basis for thinking about and struggling with the health of democracy in the United States. They focus and they ask us to focus on structuring our understanding of democracy, its cultural and institutional supports, by beginning with the terror of radical vulnerability. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Chip, because I think we want to engage Carol. We want to start to bring folks into this.
Thank you, Melvin. That was really powerful. I want to start by addressing Carol Wainwright and her wonderful chapter on Anna Julia Cooper, chapter 8 of the book. Let me start, Carol, by saying that this chapter really left a deep impression on me. And it actually was really formative. As I was editing your chapter, I was working on the chapter on Audre Lorde. And your interpretation of the idea of radical relationality really helped shape, my interpretation of Lorde later in the book. And so I want to ask you first, you call Cooper's politics a politics of radical relationality. And so I just wondered if you could talk to all of us about what you think radical relationality means.
First of all, thank everyone for inviting me to be part of this. And I'm so grateful to be part of this extraordinarily beautiful project, this book. So Jack, I want to say that when I talk about Cooper's politics of radical relationality, what I'm suggesting is that she advances a type of political thinking that emphasizes interdependence as the key metaphor for envisioning the manifestations of American democratic values, or this notion of democratic culture that Melvin just described. Cooper was a very astute philosophical thinker, as well as a activist and educator. And in her writings, she emphasizes a type of a view of humanity that suggests that we are all interdependent. There's no such thing as an isolated entity. And with this particular approach, what I call this relational ontology, Cooper actually begins to challenge the manifestations of white supremacy that she saw operating in her era. She also felt that until America, as a young nation, until America could actualize itself in terms of creating the conditions, the material conditions in which every entity within the nation could actualize itself, then it would fail. So she had a fascinating notion of the one and the all, or a fascinating notion that you, as a person who might be perceived with white skin, you really are a member of my humanity. And when you see my humanity with Black skin, you should see yourself as Black. So she sort of predated or she anticipated a lot of what we're calling critical race theory, and understanding how racial distortions actually challenge people to see that they really are the same. But she did not have a very naive universal notion of humanity. It was an embodied, concretizing notion that we all, she did not use evolutionary theory, but she's basically, through her philosophical thinking, was suggesting that we all have the same substance, we're all of the same nature to some extent.
Lori, does Morrison have a conception of relationality that's similar to Cooper's?
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute myself. I think one of the things that's so critical about Morrison is the way in which she's so embedded in the language of the communities that she is comes out of, and that inform her understanding both of what is possible, what is beautiful, what is just. And I think where there's a really nice nice connection with Cooper too is in that sense of the, you know, the wisdom of the people who weren't asked. So the, you know, Cooper's claim about, you know, her only when and where I enter is calling on a kind of knowledge, a kind of wisdom that has not been taken adequate account of. And I loved Carol's chapter. I mean, I think that notion of radical relationality also connects in interesting ways to how Morrison understands the project of writing itself, which is always dependent on a reader to be participatory. It depends on a kind of egalitarianism that that's a real risk in many ways for Morrison, but she continually is putting her work out in a way that is demanding that the reader relate to both the characters and to the text and the author in a way that I think speaks to what Carol just said about that sense of a shared humanity. And in some senses, even though her voice is so different from Walker's, a shared sense of inquiry, as Walker would put it.
May I ask a question, Lori? So Cooper actually, this is why I associate her thinking with process philosophy, and which is a variant of pre-evolutionary thinking. Cooper did not see humanity in a static way. It was always emergent, perfecting itself. And this is part of her politics. And part of her politics has this theme of perfectionism, but it was within a naturalized format. So I wonder, would you see that also in Morrison?
That's a really great question. I think I'm less sure of I'm less sure about how to connect it to process philosophy per se. And I think because for Morrison, she's so rooted in the actual existing practices of communities, how people speak to each other, what are the ways in which they use language in engaging with each other. And I think that's really where her focus resides. I'm not sure I answered your question, but it's a really interesting point.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Yeah, Cooper, the reason I find her so appealing as a thinker is that she had her foot in many different camps. She was an educator, she was a community activist, and she was a philosopher. And she was well read. She in my chapter in my book, I actually I look at the connections that she had with Emerson and some of the transcendentalists. And Cooper was very, very steeped in classical Western thinking. And she knew that, the so-called best books of the day. And she took a lot of this literature and these theories, and she turned them on their heads with grounding everything in her understanding of white supremacy. She didn't call it white supremacy, but she basically talked about, one of her words is negrophobia, which is a fear of blackness. And not just a fear, but an intentional aim to keep Blacks from flourishing and actualizing themselves. And to me, that's, Jack, going back to your question, that's the heart of her political thinking, that America would never be America until it transforms itself into the sphere in which the all and the one are connected in this very organic way.
So I just wanted to get in here because I wonder, and I want to come back to Carol's question and get you and Lori's response to this, and then I'll shift to Michael. But one of the things I thought was so fascinating about Lori's essay on Morrison, in light of the question, Carol, that you asked about perfectionism, and perfectionism in this context for the wider audience is a process about development and growth and improvement. So it's not a sort of static vision of a perfect state. But one of the things I thought was so fascinating, Lori, was Morrison's understanding of the written word as the site of discovery, as the site of recreation, and as a natural, right, a sort of a natural entity, right, product from us. And so it seemed to me that in this sort of way in which Morrison thinks about language, in part because of the sort of horror of white supremacy, the way she thinks about language performs or enacts the kind of perfectionism that I think Cooper makes, right, that she places at the heart of her philosophy. I mean, is that a way, potentially a way of bringing these two together?
I think that's a great question. And I also, want to make sure that my own sort of suspicions about perfectionism are not playing too great a role here. I mean, one of the things that I think that's so striking about Morrison, especially at those moments where she's trying to think about what can and can't be done in the master's tongue, as she puts it, what you can do with American English and what you can't do, is her consciousness of, there's an aspirational dimension to it, always, but also always a consciousness of failure. But you don't stop just because you fail, you keep going. And so I think when she talks about, writing is that one place where she feels free and authoritative, when she talks about the dangers of regimes that harass or exile writers and our need for writing. I mean, I think in some sense, her felt sense of the way in which as human beings we need writers and writing is connected to a kind of perfectionist impulse. At the same time, she's so attentive to limitation, to the possibility of failure, that there's, I think, a kind of an aspiration that is always bound up with a sensibility of the dangers of putting excessive faith in what we as frail, beings will accomplish in some senses.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I almost called it a kind of tragic sensibility, but I think that that's not quite what I'm trying to reach for. I mean, she has a deep and passionate love for human beings, but I think part of what she loves so much is, it goes along with such an account of how we hurt each other, how we dominate, how that I think it's a different, I think it's a different orientation than, say, what we find in A Voice from the South. Now, I could be wrong about that, but that's my take for tonight.
Bring Michael and Neil in on this.
Yeah, sure. So
go ahead.
Right. So let's transition to Michael, and then we'll open it back up once more. So Michael, you wrote the chapter on A. Philip Randolph, which was a wonderful chapter, and you Randolph is a challenging figure here. I mean, you suggest at the very outset that Randolph, toward sort of the end of his life, was seen as less radical than he understood himself to be. And you say in the chapter that some of this has to do with sort of the changing rhetoric of Randolph over time and his willingness to sort of, work in the beltway of American politics, right? But one of the things that you sort of insist in the chapter, right? I mean, you insist that we should nonetheless see Randolph as consistent throughout his life, right? So the question, maybe you can open this up for us. I mean, why should we read him this way, and if we do read him this way, what are sort of the central principles that serve as the sort of through line in his work in life?
Okay, thanks. Let me say at the outset that I too am extremely honored and happy to be part of this great collection. I spent a lot of yesterday and today reading through it, including the introduction twice, and it's really a great piece of work, and I'm glad to be part of it. Should also say that I was very attracted by the idea of, like Chip had asked me if I would write the essay on a Philip Randolph, and I should say that I'd known about Randolph all my life. A lot of my own scholarship and activism, labor and race related, class related. I bumped into him a lot, but I didn't know much about him. So it was a great opportunity for me to spend a period of time reading through his essays, as well as reading biographies. And one of the first things that becomes apparent, and it's just what you alluded to in my essay, is that if you read biographies of Randolph, he seems to be just replete with contradictions, that he holds certain positions and then he changes them quite a bit. He was somebody who early on had admired the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin, and then he becomes a rabid anti-communist. He was somebody as a young man, as an essayist and editor, was extremely adversarial, confrontational, abrasive, and hostile to elites of all sorts. And then he becomes known as the gentle warrior, as an effective lobbyist and a skilled negotiator with elites, both in government and in business. And there's just all these he wavered on his pacifism. He always insisted that he was a pacifist and anti-imperialist, but he took different positions on various wars. He was staunchly opposed to World War I. He was opposed to World War II, but he also then co-organized the Democratic Action, Union for Democratic Action, to defeat fascism. He initially refused to criticize the Vietnam War, and then, like many other civil rights activists, did come along and become a critic. So we can go through all these apparent contradictions and paradoxes. But I think that what I discovered and what I tried to argue in my essay is, if you just read his essays, read his speeches, read the currents of thought, one sees a lot greater consistency. It's full of problems and still contradictions, but at least they're consistent to some degree. They make sense of his life. And I would say that, the most important aspect of his thought that I think was, for his own day and for today, was his focus on the relationship between capitalism and racism. He insisted that there's always a relationship between capitalism and racism, but it was sometimes a bit too simplistic, sometimes a bit more complicated and sophisticated and subtle. At least I would say that. For him, the connection was inextricable. And so he wanted to focus on capitalism as both a source of racism, but also overcoming capitalism as part of a critical part of the project to challenge racism and to challenge the gross inequality of a white supremacist regime. This required him, in his own view, while he opposed racial segregation, he resisted racial integration as a primary goal, because he said that we should not bring workers of color into predatory, hierarchical, capitalist political economy. Should not join that. We should transform that. That is, in some ways, I think, the essence of what he insisted on. Now, the relationship between capitalism and racism for him was problematic. In the process, he as a young man, he always insisted that capitalism is what mattered most. And that in some ways one could see in his thought that racism was really epiphenomenal. It was derivative of capitalism. The capitalism was a product of property ownership and subjection of people to being owned status, and that racism was a product of capitalist effort to divide workers against each other, and therefore as a kind of hedge against any kind of united working class challenge to the capitalist class. And there's something to that, of course, but it's rather simplistic. And that becomes part of the reason why he pursued a class first approach early on. He said what we need is a multiracial working class movement to challenge capitalism. And once we overthrow capitalism, then racism will become a less marked and perhaps not very, it may even go away. And that would say that he probably did not appreciate the independent force of white supremacist racism, that he perhaps dismissed it too casually or didn't take it seriously enough. But I think that the important thing was that he argued persistently that if we're going to deal with the historical legacy of disenfranchisement, which is economic, material disenfranchisement of African Americans, that we have to, challenge capitalism and transform capitalism or move beyond capitalism, and have to do that to promote, through democratic means, but promote democratic socialism. And that was his consistent theme, was the commitment to democratic socialism. Now, there is a lot of variation in what he seemed to mean by democratic socialism. We can talk about that. But nevertheless, it was, he always said we need democratic means and a democratic socialist ends. And that, in that regard, he differed from, I think, a lot of the other civil rights activists in the 19th century, especially from the NAACP and the sort of mainstream or moderate civil rights movement, many of whom began as socialists, but then moved away from socialism and moved away from economic issues and issues of violence toward issues of public desegregation, school desegregation, and the like.
So Michael, I wonder if we could bring in on this, this last point that you just made. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Randolph is that in his own time, right, you have someone like, you have someone like Hubert Harrison, for example, who seems to sort of hold in view both the sort of exploitative character of capitalism, while sort of holding alongside, right, the problem of white supremacy. And if we were to look a little further ahead, right, and we think about someone like Angela Davis, and here I want to invite Neil to say a word, her Marxism. So Neil, how is it that Davis is able to seemingly sort of hold these two features in view that at least the early Randolph is very suspicious of?
So first, I want to kind of echo my not only thanks to Chip and Melvin, but also just congratulations. I mean, this is a masterful achievement. I know we're getting serious with our presentations, but it's a celebration as well from an idea that began in conferences to this final product. So thank you. And I'm going to screen share in a second, but Aimé Césaire wrote a letter of resignation to the French Communist Party, the letter to Maurice Thorez, where he says, I became a Marxist and the ethical dimensions of Marxist thought in the service of Black people. I didn't want Black people to be used in the service of Marxism or communism. Do you understand? In other words, Marxism and the ethical dimensions of Marxist thought in the service of Black people and Black liberation and freedom, not as Ralph Ellison, the figure in Invisible Man, or I Am, his discussion of the brotherhood, his archetype of the Communist Party USA, where the Invisible Man is being used in the service of a predominantly white organization rather than the other way around. And so I would perhaps begin to answer that question to say that Davis has had a balance between her scholar activism and how Marxist thought has influenced her, and I think arguably because of that she has understood Marxism, and later in her life, as I try and articulate in my chapter, also kind of feminist political thought, Black feminist thought, in the service of some kind of wider preoccupations. And so I know I'll keep it, I will keep it brief in these opening remarks, but I did just want to share a few images, so if you all will indulge me. So the chapter that I wrote is entitled Angela Y. Davis, Abolitionism, Democracy, and Freedom. And I believe I saw in the chat, there was a question about what was perhaps surprising for each of us in terms of our writing on these thinkers. And what surprised me the most was for a living thinker in which much of their writing, past and present, is readily available. No one seems to be engaging much of Davis's work besides regular text, women, race, and class. A certain series of essays, reflections on the Black woman's role in the community of slaves. And so I wanted to dig deeper into this paradox. So just indulge me with some images. If we were to say the image of Angela Davis, and just say kind of Angela Davis, Angela Y. Davis, Angela Yvonne Davis, there are a couple. Here's one, free Angela Davis and all political prisoners, kind of image from the period in which Angela Davis was on trial for a crime that she did not commit. Image kind of number two, there is the image of the kind of the charismatic figure, both of which these images have, what both of these have in common is also the image of Angela Davis with the afro. I didn't choose, the title that I would have chosen that wouldn't have been in line with the different titles of the book was It's More Than Just an Afro, but I went with a different title. But really, you get the point. I became more interested in how can we understand texts such as Angela Davis's more recent Freedom is a Constant Struggle, that I think it bears underscoring that the author of the foreword to this book is Cornel West, who I think all of us, or at least many of us here and also viewing this launch, are aware of West's kind of recent denial by Harvard University for being able to come up as a tenured member of Harvard's faculty. And so Melvin, to your kind of point that you're posing to me, with his, how has Davis really kind of balanced, not just her Marxism, but her scholar activism? I'd say it's complicated. We have to remember that Angela Davis, when Davis was completing her doctoral studies working with Herbert Marcuse, Davis was a lecturer at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the then Governor Ronald Reagan had organized at the state level to have Davis fired for her positions because of her membership then in the Communist Party USA. And so this balance between one's scholarship and one's activism is one that Davis was not the kind of the first thinker, nor the last among Black intellectuals in this volume and also in the wider Black world. But I think we can learn a lot of lessons. Perhaps the most, going back to the surprise of trying to write about Angela Davis, the book for me that I think is the most underappreciated work by Davis is Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism. And I really want to kind of underscore this because I don't know how many of you have recently seen this film, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which is a film that was recently released based on a play by August Wilson. Now, what's very interesting about this and also troubling about this is it's a kind of fantastic film, except for the fact that we learn nothing and very little about Ma Rainey, right? The woman who's at the center of this. Some have said this is because August Wilson's plays particularly focus a lot on Black men. But there is a larger story than in my chapter. I actually try to uncover where Davis talks about the ways in which even in her own thought, she not only did not kind of incorporate the work of Black women intellectuals and activists, even in much of her own early writings, but in this work, half of Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism is a study of three figures, Gertrude, Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith, and Billie Holiday, and half are simply transcriptions of the lyrics of these figures. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll be quiet and join the group again, is what did I not get to do in this chapter because of time. I tried to distill what I take to be 3 concepts central to the life and work of Angela Y. Davis. The first, abolitionism. The second, democracy, which in our opening we heard some about. And third, the idea of freedom. And so for me, this idea of abolitionism is what really cuts across Davis's notions of democracy and freedom. And by abolitionism, we can understand through Davis the idea of either eradicating or mitigating as much as possible slavery in all of its forms, past, present, and future. But a colleague of mine at Williams, Joy James, who we haven't shared our most recent works on Davis, but after I had submitted this book chapter, Joy James had published in the Black Perspectives a piece called Airbrushing Revolution for the Sake of Abolition, in which James makes a distinction between what she calls academic abolitionists, rhetorical abolitionists, and what she calls revolutionaries. And James implicates Angela Davis, not necessarily the early Davis, but the more recent Davis, as an academic abolitionist, and raises questions about what James calls a revolutionary. And I think James and I have very different, I'll end the screen here, very different views about that distinction in Angela Davis's own career, but it's really raising this question, going back to that prompt on, is Marxism in the service of, is Marxism in the service of Black people, or Black people in the service of Marxism or other political kind of ideologies? How are we understanding questions of unfreedom and the undemocratic life? How do we understand what does it mean to be free and live in a democratic society? And if we take, like the philosophy of Maranaj suggests, that fundamentally democracy and freedom are not fixed and static states, then we have to then think very seriously about how that can be realized. And I think Davis offers us an opportunity to not only kind of articulate that in various mediums and various forms, but also not only the benefits, but some of the challenges that are faced when one tries to wed one's kind of intellectual work with one's political commitment. So I'll stop there, but I see that in terms of thinking about A. Philip Randolph and many other figures who perhaps shift over time. Or in the chat, I think I saw Booker T. Washington, in which people forget that Marcus Garvey came to the US to work with Booker T. Right, Garvey, in other words, when people don't think about Garvey necessarily as a Black conservative, they think of him as a Black radical, but Garvey came to the US to work with Booker T, and Booker T died right before Garvey was to come, but Garvey came anyway, which means that we have to have a more nuanced understanding of African-American political thought and the challenges that not only intellectuals, but activists face when trying to put these big ideals and materialize them, not just for the self, but for a mass.
We have a little more. We have a little more than a half hour left, and it'd be nice, I think, if we brought the audience in to answer some of their questions. So, Andrew, you want to feed us a question?
Okay, well, yeah, we've got some questions in the queue. Just a reminder in terms of our process here, we're taking questions in the Q&A box. We'll also take some spoken questions. If you'd like to speak, just submit a request in the Q&A box. We'll call on you. And if you could maybe say something about what your question will be about in the box, that's fine. But we would like some people to have a chance to speak. Okay, there's a couple questions about the use of your book. And I thought maybe we could start with that. There's a question about whether it'll be a companion volume of primary sources, and another question about imagining this as a work for scholars or a book for teaching undergraduates. How would you, I guess is a question for Melvin and Jack in particular, how would you like this book to be used?
Well, I think that when we ask people to write the chapters, we ask them to do two things. First, we wanted them to provide a synoptic view of the thinker, like something that could function as a survey of the thinker. But the second thing that we did is we asked them to provide a distinctive interpretation of the thinker as well. So we asked them to sort of combine both the survey mandate with also an interpretation that was going to advance the arguments. And I think that speaks to the sort of the two kind of major audience interventions we want to make. Is first, we want this to be a teaching text. That's why it's so reasonably priced at $35. Is so that it could be adopted in undergraduate classes, in graduate classes, and perhaps even in high schools. And that it could also be something that will help send both students and readers back to the text. But secondly, is that, I mean, every essay in the book is engaged in its scholarly literature or adjacent scholarly literature. So they make specific scholarly interventions, and in many cases, I would say really, in really major interventions. So I think that it's something that, scholars are definitely going to want to grapple with, but it's also something I think that they can assign to their students.
Great. Thank you, Jack. Returning to some of the questions in the queue, I'd like to break things back to Professor White and Professor Balfour. There's a question about Cooper's conception of radical relationality and whether it's similar to James Baldwin's ideas of mutual interdependence. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Lori, would you like me to go first?
That would be great.
Whoever asked that question, thank you. Absolutely, yes, absolutely. In my book, I actually, one of my primary books, I actually have Baldwin and Cooper and Du Bois as conversationalists around this idea of radical relationality to some extent. So yes.
I think it's a great question, and Baldwin was such an important figure for Morrison. She credits him really with, as she puts it, sort of decolonizing the American language and giving her a way to be in the world and to be connected. One thing that I think that where I think there may be some tension with Baldwin, and I think you also see this in the really wonderful chapter on Cooper in the text that may set Morrison apart, is that she does not identify with an idea of Americanness as a primary affiliation. So even as her work is profoundly democratic, she's very clear that she has, more of a diasporic sensibility, and it's not an American democracy per se that she's seeking to realize. And I think Baldwin moves back and forth on that question some, but I think that's one place where the underlying idea of relationality could still be there, but the relation to the nation is quite different.
Lori, that's an excellent point. And I think a reason why Cooper and Baldwin emphasize a certain distinctive type of Americanness is that they actually went abroad. Both of them went to France. And Cooper herself actually wrote a dissertation on the French Revolution. And she was aware of the conception of democracy or nascent forms of democracy in other Western European intellectuals. And so she saw within America this promise, not the manifestation of it, vis-a-vis what was going on in European history. So that's a fascinating notion of Toni.
Thank you both. I have another question from the audience that kind of follows from your answers just now. That's from David Owen. The question is, African-American political thinkers are both American political thinkers, but also situated with a coercively forged transnational diaspora of African descent. And perhaps many also see themselves in that light. If so, how does that make a difference to African-American political thought within American political thought? That's a question to any panelist, I think. African diaspora?
Like you unmuted first.
No one wants to take this up. So one of the things in the introduction, Chip and I try to do is carve out the distinctive expression of African-American political thought within the wider horizon of Africana philosophy. And for the vast majority of the thinkers that we cover in the book, they sort of center the experience of African Americans in the United States as the sort of primary experience from which they will theorize and philosophize. This does not preclude, as we know, this does not preclude them from both thinking about their relationship to other darker peoples of the world. We think about Du Bois. There's no way to sort of make sense of sort of the 19th century period that we cover in the early part of the book, as African Americans are trying to make sense of their own agency in light of Haiti, right? So there's ways in which the struggles that Black people are experiencing beyond the shores of the United States serve as, in some instances, it serves as support to remind African Americans to help them see their own agency. In other instances, it serves as a ground to think both domestically about the position of African Americans and their connection to people beyond. So we think of someone like, we think of someone like Du Bois. But I think in all instances, there is this kind of, I mean, there's some exceptions here, right? In the book for sure, right? Martin Delany is constantly saying we need to leave, right? Marcus Garvey is in this. Marcus like, we got to go, right? We got to get out of here. But for the vast majority of them, they are constantly sort of grappling with this place, the United States that they call home, as sort of the primary, unit of analysis.
Great. Thank you, Melvin. Our next question, there's been a few in the queue about that. This is for Professor McCann to elaborate a little bit on A. Philip Randolph's socialism, democratic socialism, his Marxism and his politics. Michael?
Sure. There's a lot to be said about his democratic socialism, because he never really laid out a singular kind of vision about what that meant. But I think there's a reason why Randolph was attracted to Marxism. That early on, he was very much, he's a critique of the sort of NAACP civil rights, legalism, litigation strategy, et cetera, and was very much committed to mass direct action as a way to change American society, American capitalism. And in Marx, what he found, one of the things that I found really interesting, and I focus on the essay, was his interest in rights discourse. He was on one hand very critical of litigation, legalism, American law, lawyers, and everything, but he was kind of not obsessed with, but persistently engaged with rights. And what I think he found in the early Marx, especially on the Jewish question, was a sort of tension between property rights and citizenship rights. Because what Randolph, especially as a young person, focused on were property rights, is what enabled capitalists to dominate both wage labor and also unwaged labor, slave labor. And that was the source for him of racial domination, which is simplistic, I think. But what he found in there is if you take the idea of citizenship rights, equal rights, and turn that against property rights, you not only try and trump property rights with equal rights, reconstructed the idea of equal rights itself. a reconstructed idea, sort of what Patricia Williams talks about as an alchemy of rights, so that rights now become all about interdependence and commitment and about substantive material equality and so forth. And that was a big part of the attraction to Marx for him. I think what was lacking, though, is precisely what Lori and Carol were talking about earlier, is a real sense about relationality. He had an idea of interdependence, but it's very abstract. It was very individualistic. It was very, I would say, masculine. And that he couldn't, and that's what was lacking to some degree in his attraction to Marxism. And so a lot of those ideas lingered on, but the actual connection to Marx faded to some degree. But he was very much a democratic socialist. And we can talk about different forms of that. He was very much democratic in means. He was very committed to nonviolence. He did seem to have a state-centered conception of democratic socialism, but it was one where the state was really controlled by people from the bottom, people in workplaces, masses organized in alternative parties, not the Democratic Republican Party, but Socialist Party, and we can talk about the specifics about what that meant. He didn't talk much about that, though, after his early writings. So it's a little bit hard to know exactly what he was thinking, especially because he became more closely connected to the mainstream civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. I do think that his commitment to labor and his early belief in a multiracial working class revolution was really critical. But of course, that foundered immediately because there's one irony is that when he became the president of the sleeping porters, he had never been a sleeping porter, he'd never been a worker in that industry, and he hadn't even been a member of the union. So he's already kind of a strange contradictory position. And he quickly found out that race was not just epiphenomenal and derivative of capitalism, because he foundered on not only fighting with white capitalists, but also with white working class. And I think that's what really challenged his basic idea that race was derivative or epiphenomenal or whatever, that there was an intrinsic force and power to racism and white supremacy in America.
Thank you, Michael. And I just welcome our panelists too. If there's any response to an answer that you'd like to give, please feel free to jump in. My next question I'm taking from the queue is from Nicholas Tampio. The question has to do with the overarching narrative that your book might have. Do you think that the volume has a kind of a historical narrative or a thread that runs from beginning to end over time? And then we have another question from Krishna asking about the historical background and these different thinkers. So I was wondering if anybody could talk about change over time or some sort of historical narrative in this collection.
I could say a little bit about it, if I can jump in. And then I saw also a question in the chat. I don't know if it was still there in terms of, I think there was a question, did Angela Davis get fired? So maybe, can I take those, maybe have these together. This, I guess, in terms of the prompt as a contributor, as I understood it, that we were tasked with trying to on the one hand, providing readers with a kind of historical life and times context of the different figures in which we are writing about. In my case, Angela Davis, and then also trying to not make it merely about kind of the biographical, but also what concept or concepts are particularly central to that thinker. And so instead of just ad hocing this, I'm just going to read a paragraph from what I wrote, because in essence, one of the tensions that I found in that invitation was the asymmetrical focus or the asymmetrical assumption that when writing about Black thinkers, one always has to immediately talk about their biography, right? In ways of writing about particularly the study of non-Black thinkers and particularly white thinkers, there doesn't seem to be that assumption. And yet at the same time, what might we learn from the lived experiences of thinkers nonetheless? So I just wrote this near the beginning of my chapter, and it just reads as follows. The problem of biography in Africana thought, especially acute in the discourse on Davis, is the asymmetrical attention analysts give to details of Black intellectuals' lived experiences at the expense of the interpretation of their ideas. Under this logic, the knowledge of who a thinker is supersedes knowing what constitutes principles of her, his, or their thought. At the same time, however, there is an issue of circularity. Experiences may also prove useful in the formulation of a thinker's key concepts, whether recounted in genres of autobiography, nonfiction essays, historical fiction, poetry, music, or other mediums, and in the interpretation of these experientially derived notions. One last part. Davis remarks that philosophy, quote, is supposed to perform the task of generalizing aspects of experience, and not just for the sake of formulating generalizations, end quote. And so that kind of balance between the kind of the biographical and lived experience, and then how do we interpret ideas, I think is a kind of a healthy tension that making it through now some of the different amazing chapters in the volume that I've seen, and to that small, kind of not insignificant short question about, was Angela Davis fired from UCLA? Initially, Angela Davis, not merely from then Governor Ronald Reagan, but the Board of Regents of California had attempted to fire Davis in the 1969-1970 academic year when she was a lecturer at UCLA. Davis was finishing her doctorate at UC San Diego, but was teaching in the philosophy department as a lecturer. And so colleagues in philosophy and across the campus ended up having activism and solidarity with Davis against the firing. And so initially Davis was not fired. Subsequently, the Board of Regents then did another attempt to fire Davis, which was successful. One point that I note in the chapter as well is that, and this is according to Davis, is that Davis was finishing her doctoral dissertation, and the dissertation research materials were stolen. So Davis actually was writing a dissertation on Immanuel Kant's idea of revolution, and the materials, according to Davis, were stolen. So Angela Davis is Dr. Angela Davis, but she had received an honorary doctorate in Europe Davis then used the title of doctor for kind of much of her early career. And so I say that to the point, which is, even though this was an issue about was Davis fired or not, there were also certain types of repercussions and after effects that were that balance between what does it mean to be an academic, and did agents of state actually kind of steal her research materials to finish her doctoral work. So small but important point, and thank you for those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. That's really helpful. I mean, I wanted to get in on the point first off of overarching, narrative. We actually the book is kind of, in some ways, an anti-narrative, in that we wanted to deal with 30 individual thinkers and sort of see what themes emerge up from them. We didn't want to force them into a pre-existing narrative. We didn't even want to impose a narrative on it at the end. There's a real emphasis in this book on particularity, on the particularity of the thinkers. And also, we didn't want to artificially try to box them into some sort of pre-existing framework. However, when you go into it, what I think you do see is that there are clusters of chapters where very strong themes emerge. Okay, so you have chapter 2 on Walker, by Melvin Rogers, chapter 3 on Delany by Robert Gooding Williams, and then I believe it's chapter 4. Is it chapter 5 on Frederick Douglass by Sharon Krause? Those chapters, the African American engagement with the Republican tradition comes through so strongly in those chapters that you sort of realize that is sort of the ground of debate in a very, very vivid way, and a crucial ground of debate in early 19th century. And you start to see the way in which Republican language is just suffused through African American thought at that time. There are other places, I think, where you see, like especially in Nick Bramel's chapter on Harriet Jacobs and Carol Wayne White's chapter on Anna Julia Cooper, to an extent of my chapter on Audre Lorde, that the theme of relationality and of the relational nature of citizenship, of equality, of personhood comes through very strongly. I guess the final thing I would say on the overarching narrative is that one thing you should definitely, read is there's some very sort of haunting reflections at the end of the introduction on in this section called the Socratic question, which is primarily this section as this collaborative volume. This is primarily Melvin's inspiration, in which the paragraphs discuss about, even for those people like Du Bois who ultimately left America, they were very much the tragic experiences they experienced in America left a deep imprint on their thought. So there is this there is this sort of narrative, I think, of whatever else America has been, positive or negative, it is fundamentally shaped global race thinking in a very, for better and for worse.
Great, thank you. We have another question in the queue. Speaking of particularity of voices, this question from Sasha Lee is asking, is pointing out that there's a chapter about Booker T. Washington, and that it's one of the more conservative voices in the book. I know that there's a chapter about Clarence Thomas as well. Could anyone speak to the conservative Black voices in the book, and whether, how they fit into the overall volume?
I want to leave answering that question to Melvin and Chip, but I did want to note that actually, as I was thinking about Nick's question about the overarching narrative, that one of the wonderful things about a book that really emphasizes the heterogeneity of African-American political thought, and I would say maybe singularity of these distinctive views, is that Clarence Thomas is in between Angela Davis and Cornel West, which I think is a wonderful place to put him.
I think that Chip, you want to go on this, or you want me to? So I think that the conservatism that runs through the book in the chapters on Booker T. Washington, you see this in the chapter on Zora Neale Hurston, and really the bracket one is the Clarence Thomas. On one read, and George Schuyler fits in here most certainly. For these figures, the use of conservatism should be used very advisedly, right? Put in the bracket around Clarence Thomas, because as we see in the chapter on Booker T. Washington, written by Desmond Jagmohan, Booker T. Washington was engaged in the art of political deception. And I think it is quite significant that whether it is Marcus Garvey, whether it is Ida B. Wells, or a figure that's not in a volume, oh, he should have been in a volume, T. Thomas Fortune, three very radical figures who had a kind of partial affection. T. Thomas Fortune, most certainly, relied on resources from Booker T. Washington. And one of the reasons why this is the case is because embedded in Washington's sort of defense of economic self-help is a suspicion that white Americans really are not up to the task of treating Black people on equal terms. And so economic self-help becomes the thing to which Washington turns as the barrier to protect, well, so he thinks, to protect Black people from the onslaught of white supremacy. And of course, he has to engage in a series of deceptive maneuvers in order to secure these resources. That idea is very much the idea of someone like Marcus Garvey, and you see this idea in the writings of the lynching writings of Ida B. Wells. So I would suggest that we sort of see the volume as also an instance to reimagine these figures and the way in which some of their commitments and the terms that we associate with them do not carefully map on and sometimes they don't map on at all, to our current political configurations of those terms.
Thank you, Melvin. We have about 10 minutes remaining, and this is a question I wanted to ask toward the end, but I'm hoping that most of our panelists will have an answer for it, because it's an important one. The question comes from Mark Wood, and it was echoed by a few others as well in the queue. And the question is, to all the panelists, could you say something about what ideas from the individuals about whom you wrote are especially important for understanding and responding to our situation today, especially building resistance to the forces allied against democracy and for a liberated future? It's a big question, and I wanted to ask while we still had time. So anyone's welcome to take it.
Neil?
Yeah, well, Melvin probably knows where this is going, just because I'm ensconced now in, finishing up a book, How to Live Free in an Age of Pessimism. I believe Melvin in his opening remarks, and correct me if I'm wrong, said disappointment isn't permanent. And if disappointment is not permanent, the lesson that I've learned from Davis and also from all of these panelists and the contributors to the volume is that, to write about Afro-modern thought and the kind of African-American contributions to Afro-modern thought is to wrestle with events and ideas and experiences of disappointment and dread, questions about kind of survival and death. But I mean, we're in a pandemic. I realize that it hasn't come up since we've all been talking. We're in the midst of a pandemic that is asymmetrically, right, affecting kind of African Americans, Black and brown people living in the US, whether or not those individuals were born in the United States. That's the reality. And yet, at a moment in which Black folk had so many reasons to be pessimistic, and even perhaps even nihilistic, whether it was through electoral politics or social movements over the summer or what's going on now, there is a way in which, to that important question, that we learn that whether we're talking about democracy, whether we're talking about questions of freedom, that the African-American tradition, the collected history, that's an important part of the title, right? The title and the subtitle, the collected history points to that there's a tradition not only of surviving, but also of creating, right? Of creation. As Davis says, Davis argues that that kind of resistance is beautiful. We don't think about aesthetics in that type of way, that resistance is beautiful, even if it means a certain type of harm. To be able to, as Walker would say, and I think as Morrison would say, and as Julia Cooper would say, many people think of Cooper as the voice from the South, a voice from the South, 1892. This is someone who lived almost a century, right? Was that the process philosophy? The idea that we are mutable, but that we are still not just surviving, and we are creating, and we're experiencing disappointment, but we are also experiencing kind of joy. And I could go on, but I don't want to turn this into a service. But I would say that that's perhaps one of the takeaways. And we have to kind of think about all of this as we're kind of wrestling with the contours of this collected history. But it's a brilliant history. Political theory, philosophy, and interrelated fields can't ever be taught the same after this book. It can't. And if it's taught not the same, then that means that one is willfully disavowing or silencing this work that is here, right?
Carol or Lori?
Just briefly, I would love to also add, thank you, Neil, for that. I would like to add that for me, my work on Cooper, and I'm the interloper here, I'm the outlier, I'm a humanist. And I'm going back to a very, very basic question, I think, that goes back to Gilgamesh and haunts us to this very day. What do we mean by humanity? How do we create our humanity? And for me, the volume, this gorgeous volume, has these a legacy of intellectual thinking, activism that has challenged America in terms of its dehumanizing forces and processes that makes the question of every generation, who are we as human beings, and why are we fighting for these lofty values, if not for the sake of creating an expanded notion of humanity? So for me, it goes back to one of the, as I said before, Gilgamesh in that myth asked that question, and we're still asking that question today. Who are we as human beings?
Lori?
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful question, and you know, part of me wants to stop where Neil and Carol left off, because I think those were such beautiful answers. I think one of the things that, of the many things that Morrison trains our attention to, because you know, she's thinking about the modern world, and she says modern life begins with slavery. The idea there not being that that's where it ends. But if we think about the contemporary moment, even though many of us have experienced the pandemic as a time of non-movement, of confinement, one of the things Morrison was most concerned with, especially towards the end of her career, was the series of migrations, many of them forced, that come out of the Atlantic slave trade. So the idea of so many people around the world on the move, without sort of the basics of support, of decent way of life, of political voice, I think is, you know, attuning ourselves to movement in this moment is one of the ways, I think, to maybe to pursue the question that Carol raised about, you know, what does it mean to, you know, how are we human? And for Morrison, that fact of movement was really a critical piece of the story. And I think in the 21st century, we look at the US borders, we look at what's happening in the Mediterranean, and indeed around the world, we see that as a critical issue.
Michael?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that, and I'll go back to where Neil wrote. My initial answer would have been, this is a book of politics is aspiration, and that is a challenge and aspiration. How can we be something else? How can we be what we should be? How can we live up to the promises that we've been told about and have never been delivered? And somebody had asked a question earlier about what is politics, and I would call aspiration. It is aspirational struggle. I remember when I was first asked by, I think both Chip and Melvin, say, when you write your essay, write about this person's vision of the good life. And I said, that, you know, this guy's a labor activist I'm writing about. That's a weird question. But in fact, that was exactly the right question. It was an aspirational vision. He committed his life trying to figure it out all along. And I think that the spirit of most of these essays is precisely people struggling with their time and trying to figure it out. But it is the striving and the aspiration that rings through all of these essays, or at least the essays I've read.
In terms of political takeaway, I mean, at least from the chapter that I wrote on Lorde, there are many things to take away from it, but the main thing I would emphasize is coalition. That one of the things that you know, I think you get from Lorde, and also many of the people she was in conversation with, specifically Bernice Johnson Reagan, is that coalition is painful, but coalition is also intensely creative. And I was thinking about, you know, my training as a political scientist in the early 2000s. You know, we read all this really dry literature on coalition, and we didn't read a single Black feminist theorist, which is striking, since I find that Black feminist theory actually has the richest reflections on coalition of any literature I've encountered. And for the time that we are in, it's going to take painful coalitions to fight off fascism. And so I think that she offers a lot of resources in that respect.
So I won't give any sort of one takeaway on David Walker, but I would say about the entirety of the volume and all of these contributions is that uh, there are several things that I think all of the chapters share that is sort of constitutive of the tradition of which they express, and that is that at the heart of a healthy democratic society must be the ability to speak honestly about the ways in which that society is complicit in harming those that otherwise should be acknowledged as its citizens. And so there's a fundamental question that all these thinkers put to the readers and put to the United States. I mean, must truth be beautiful before you accept it? Or are you able to grapple with the ugliness as a condition of the transformation of society? And the fact that this tradition puts it to its fellows again and again, although there are some that are willing to leave for sure, but the vast majority of them are willing to put this question again and again. Why do they do it? They do it, I mean, what Baldwin tells us, out of civic love, right? And that's not meant to be sappy, right? It's a sort of deep form of identification with the polity that has given shape to those that belong to it. And it is, in my sense, and I think for the volume, that expression of civic love, right, which brought Baldwin back, which kept a number of people constantly trying to pressure the United States to be something better than what it is. That same civic love actually sent many away, right? And so even as they, in some instances, even as they wanted to leave, Du Bois at the end of his life leaves, still though meditating on this country and what he perceived to be its fundamental failures. So I would say that I think that these are some of the crucial elements that run through the volume, and what binds them all together is, I think, this constant confrontation with the persistence and the permutation of white supremacy. So I'll stop there.
Well, we've come to the end of our program, and we're a little over time, but before we go, I just wanted to offer Melvin and Jack a chance for a final comment, if you have one. But before I do that, I just want to remind everyone that on the University of Chicago Press website, you can purchase this book with a promotional code and save 20% between now and March 2nd. So you can find a link in the chat for that, and we will also send out a link by email to everyone. But with that, Melvin and Jack, do you have final words?
I feel like we as a panel have said it collectively, so I'll just leave it at that. And we hope you find the book useful.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for this evening. The video of this event will be available on the Harry Bridges Center's YouTube channel within the week. And we'll also be sending an email to everyone about that. So with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and thanks again. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.